afternoon, everybody. Just another friendly reminder that if you did call into the webinar this afternoon, if you could please mute your lines just to avoid any feedback and any background noise during the webinar today. So again, thank you so much for joining us.
How do I do that? Thanks for telling me. How do I do that?
There should be a mute function on the phone that you have dialed in from. So whether that be through settings or through the telecom. Or you can feel free to hang up. So if you hang up, you will still be able to hear the audio as it's being broadcasted through your computer speakers. So my name is Samantha Fauteur. I am the program coordinator here on the suicide prevention team at the Mental Health Commission of Canada. And I'm very happy to be hosting this webinar with you today. So just before we get started, I just wanted to go through a couple housekeeping items. So the audio is provided in broadcast mode through the computer speakers. So you can hear us, but we should not be able to hear you. This webinar is indeed being recorded and will be posted on the MHCC website in the Webinar Archive section following the presentations within a few weeks. If you would like a copy of today's slide deck, you can download it as of now using the file pods located in the center right of your screen. So selecting the item you wish to download and click Download File. You'll notice that there's also a safety planning template available for download. So you can choose to download that either now and use that to walk through the webinar, or feel free to download it afterwards. And we invite you to send any questions using the Q&A pod, which can be found on the bottom right of your screen. The questions will be posted in the pod and will go directly to the host. We will hold most of these questions until the end of the webinar and address as many as we can. Around the world, suicide prevention is being considered as a national health priority. The World Health Organization is urging countries to implement suicide prevention strategies, and there are opportunities to learn from what other countries are doing. In Canada, suicide prevention has been identified as a federal priority since over 4,000 Canadians die by suicide every year. And when we consider the number of people who are impacted by the suicide, that being friends, family, and loved ones, that means that for each death by suicide, 25 people are severely devastated and 125 more are directly impacted. In the fall of 2016, the Government of Canada released the Federal Framework for Suicide Prevention, and work is currently underway to implement this framework. In addition to that framework, Changing Directions, Changing Lives, the Mental Health Strategy for Canada includes strategic priorities related to increasing awareness and capacity for suicide prevention in Canada. What we do know is that suicide is preventable, and that there are many organizations who are implementing innovative programs that are offering people support and awareness in decreasing suicide. As such, this webinar series is intended to support the exchange and sharing of knowledge and best practices around life promotion, suicide prevention, postvention, and intervention in Canada. Showing care and spreading hope to someone who may be vulnerable to suicide is a very important step in making a difference in their lives. Back in October, the MHCC launched a year-round online campaign to help spread some hope. The content and impact of the campaign is being built by the general public. That means that it's their words, their images, and their messages. You can find it, it's housed on the MHCC website, and the platform helps to create safe space to share inspiring messages with others. So using whatever social media platform you choose, whether that be Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, all you would have to do is post an image that you find is hopeful and use the Share Hope hashtag in order to share your content. So we would like to invite you to take a few moments today and share your message. Without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our esteemed speaker for today's webinar. Dr. Yvonne Bergmans is a suicide intervention consultant at the Suicide Studies Research Unit of the Arthur Summer Rottenberg's Chair in Suicide and Depression Studies. Based at a St. Michael's Hospital, she's involved in both clinical and research endeavors. She has established a 20-week group intervention for people who have experienced 2 or more suicide attempts. We are very pleased to have Yvonne join us today, And I would now like to pass it over to Yvonne to get us started.
Hi there. Welcome. Can you hear me? Just making sure that the audio is working.
Yes, Yvonne, we can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, great. So welcome, and I hope that you'll find some of this or parts of this or maybe even the whole thing useful for you. As we begin, we recognize that we know that suicide risk will fluctuate over time. And clients will tell us that this can fluctuate within a day, within an hour. And when people are emotionally escalated, as some people will call it the pit of hell and some people will call it the emotional salad spinner, the ability to problem solve or to access what they did before to keep safe will not be as accessible because their memory is limited at that time. So when they're flooded, they can't think. So when we're talking about creating a safety plan, we're talking about practicing when the iron is cold. So that allows folks to develop strategies, skills, and rehearse and making those strategies more explicit when they are, in fact, in a less escalated state. Bless you. What we're looking at is that suicide is a behavior, and we wish to create options for safer behaviors. So when we're looking at the different theoretical frameworks and we're looking at the different treatment interventions that are available for suicide thoughts and behaviors, we're going to use whatever we have available based on our own training, what we know, what the client knows. And when we're looking at the intervention that we do here, it's dependent very much on the facilitator's skill, their interest, their comfort, and the applicability at any given session. So there are going to be times when you're going to want to work on a safety plan. However, first you're just going to talk about early warning signs. You're not going to work through the entire plan. So what we're looking at is an adaptation of Stanley and Brown's safety plan template that they created in the VA in the U.S. And our focus on it is, the bottom line is, how do you keep yourself as safe as possible? For those of you who have downloaded the template, you'll see that at the top it says, I am responsible for my decision to live. That can be a really, really challenging statement. And at the same time, what we're also inviting somebody to think about is, can I consider the possibility of choosing not to die right now? And in so doing, how do I keep myself as safe as I can? That's in the immediate moment of like the height or moving toward the height of escalation. Being able to contact somebody and say things are going up is a really wonderful way of saying, hey, well done. You did that on your own. It's not that we reached out to you. So when we look at creating a safety plan, we're looking at 6 steps. We're looking at identifying the early warning signs. We're looking at de-escalation and coping strategies. We're looking, oh, sorry about that. We've got people and places as well as the distraction, self-soothing, and grounding. We've got personal support folks, professional support, and creating a safer environment. And I'm going to go through each of these steps as we continue. So when we're looking at early warning signs, we're looking at it from the perspective of what happens to you in your body, what happens emotionally, what are some of the behaviors that you engage in that let you know that things aren't going so well? What are some of the things that you're thinking or what's going on in your head that's letting you know, I don't usually think about this all the time. So we want folks to dig deeper. Ask the people who know, care, and love them, what do you see if you realize that I'm starting to become unwell, or I'm starting to nosedive, or I'm starting to escalate, whatever language that the client uses. And you look for the pattern. So, you know, somebody made the comment, I didn't think about forgetting my keys 3 times in a week. Now when I think about it, it was a sign that something was off. Somebody else said that they become addicted to CNN or to violent movies. There are different people who will identify different behaviors that they engage in as they're starting to become more at risk. And we're looking at the more awareness we can create, the more options and choices you have, the safer you can keep yourself. Sometimes we're just going to get the physical signs and symptoms like shaking, toe tapping. Some of the behavioral is sleeping being off, eating being off. Some of the cognitions might be, you know, I call myself stupid a whole lot more, or I tell myself that I'm useless. What are some of the negative self-talk pieces that people find that they engage in? When we're looking at the de-escalation and coping slide, we're looking at it from the perspective of what can you do on your own. So it's looking at you are your greatest resource. You are the person who has the courage, who has the resilience. And when you are aware, what are the things that you can do without having to go to other people? So this is looking at your own internal coping strategies. This is where you can review what's worked on previous occasions. You can't necessarily do that when somebody's in the height of a crisis because, as we mentioned, executive functioning, autobiographical memory are compromised. You got to wait for the floodwaters to come down before they can actually access those parts of their brain. And identify, you know, this might not make you feel better. What's the goal here? It's to keep yourself as safe as possible and alive. There are going to be some people who will tell you that living is too big. They don't know what that is. So when we say, well, we want you to keep alive, they'll say, what's the point? Why bother? So we might want to reframe that in terms of, can you choose not to die today? Right? That breaks it down into something that is doable for the individual. We can point out that there's a real fluidity in this section whereby you can both ask for crisis de-escalation support from family and friends and professionals, and you can do it on your own as well. So sometimes it means sitting in silence, breaking things down, making lists, watching TV, taking a bubble bath, using aromatherapy. What for one person is self-soothing might be distracting for another, and for another person those might be grounding strategies. We can't assume that people already know what these things are. We want to actually have the conversation to say, what do you know? What do you do already that we can capitalize on? How can we extend that list of coping strategies for yourself? Then when we move into looking at people and places, we're not looking at people who necessarily can do or will do or are able to do crisis de-escalation. These are the folks who, you know, you need to get out of the house. Who's somebody you can go to a movie with, right? And they just talk about themselves and you don't have to say a word. Who's the person who's just really, really funny and you always enjoy being with them? Who's somebody who will just say, hey, let's go for a petty, or let's just go for a walk in the woods, or perhaps even go sit in the dog park somewhere? It's recognizing who is good for what and where is good for what. Some people like sitting in old churches because there's the smell of incense, or there's the stained glass. Some people will sit in a dog park and just watch the animals. And they're around people. They don't have to interact if they want to. We want to look at what is the difference between de-escalation and support. Because if you're going to ask for support, know who you can ask, and maybe have a conversation with the person in terms of what can they provide, what are they willing to provide, because if we have an expectation that someone is going to be able to do something for us, we better make sure that they know how and are able and willing. So it's emphasizing the boundaries around other people's abilities, capabilities, and teaching folks that not everybody is good at everything. You know, you might want your very best friend to be able to sit and listen to you cry for 2 hours, and your best friend is a doer. She's not able to do that, or he's not able to do that, or they're not able to do that. You want to find the person who can help meet a need at a particular level when you are either doing well or when you're not doing so well. So even if a person is not helpful in a crisis, they can still play a part in our lives and a role. So if mom's not a great listener, she cleans really well, so she can help clean all of the kitchen cupboards when I need some distraction. Or I feel like my entire life is chaos and I need to take a moment of control and clear off all of the counters so I can actually see space. So those are just a few ideas of places and people. It's not necessarily about the emotional support at this level. So we can always make assumptions when we're working with people, that people know how to do some of these things. Well, sometimes we have to teach them actually how to have a conversation with somebody who they want on their list of people who can support them. We want to be able to identify with them how they can access those people or that person. And we write down the access number, whether it be a cell phone, a home line, a text. Because again, remember, as the emotions go up there, the brain doesn't function so well. And so we want it to be an accessible plan, whether it be on their fridge or in their wallet or on their bedroom mirror. The point is that they can see it and they can get their hands on it. Talk about the fact that there are some people who just have bad hair days, and although they've been great in other circumstances, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be great all the time. So it's recognizing that we're all human and that we all have days when we're really on and days when we're not. The reality is that there are some times that people are going to have to say no, and it may have absolutely nothing to do with you. We also want to use the conversation to educate them on identifying what their needs are to keep safer and how to ask for those needs to be met. Recognizing that some people are going to say, I can't do that. That's okay. Do you want to knock them off the network list, or is there a particular strength that they do have where they can be kept on the list? And that changing people on this list is not unusual, because as we grow, as we develop, we have needs that change, and our needs change as we change, and sometimes theirs do as well. So naming who are the people who are good for what, and sometimes people will talk about an automatic instinct where they will say, well, I automatically call, say, my mother or my sister. And asking the question, so did you get what you needed from them? And they go, no. Okay, how can you help yourself remember who not to call at a particular time or place or at a particular level of escalation? And that, again, is dependent on knowing your own early warning signs. And can you scale those as to who is good for what and when? The next section is, and you'll notice that there's sort of a hierarchy where you begin with the resources within yourself and you move through your resources to the professionals. I think that there are some people who will consider calling a professional is kind of a failure. And it's to say, you know what, actually when you're at that level, perhaps the only person you can call is a professional. Identifying who are those people, how do you get a hold of them, what is their availability, what are they good for? For instance, don't call me about medications because I know absolutely nothing about medications. So who would you call about that? When I've got GTA, I'm talking about the general Toronto area, but it's knowing who are the crisis resources in your area. And also, we have great conversations about the limitations. So, for instance, we have one whereby if somebody calls and says, I'm really in a crisis, they're great about helping them through the crisis. The minute they say they want to end their lives or they're having thoughts of ending their lives, the place immediately takes them to hospital or calls 911 and has them brought to hospital. So I think that sharing the experiences, both good and bad, and the limitations of the various places that they might call need to be discussed. For instance, we talk about emergency departments just being a crapshoot. So how are you, in fact, going to navigate having to go to an emerge if you have to? One of the things we suggest is that you, with your care provider, you write a letter identifying what it is you need at the time, what is helpful, what is not helpful, and that can be done in point form or sentences. Triage nurses, we find, tend to respond better to bullet points. What are the medications you've been on or not? And this can sometimes be helpful, and then other times, again, teach the clients that sometimes people aren't going to want to know or aren't going to care if you've got a piece of paper to say, hey, this may help you out because I can't find my words right now. I think that in emphasizing the importance of identifying the need when accessing crisis lines or warm lines is a skill that needs to be taught for a lot of folks. Because if they can say, I'm really, really feeling unsafe and I need somebody to help de-escalate or help me get grounded or just bring me back to the here and now, or give me some strategies, right? So that folks on the crisis lines are aware of what it is they are being asked to do. Identifying again for the client that the more you can identify your needs, the more people are going to be able to tell you whether they can meet them or not and not react. When we talk about suicide ideation, we talk about it as an early warning sign in and of itself. It might be, in fact, telling you that there's an emotional reality occurring and you might not have the name for it at this time. However, the question might be, what am I feeling? What do I need? And getting more aware of the different things that you need. When we have folks who talk about going to the emerge, it's what are you wanting and what are you needing from that place, or what are you needing or wanting from that person? And being realistic, is that what they provide? Teaching clients that coming into a hospital is about safety, it might not be about nurturing. If you have to go to a respite center, what are the limitations and what are the benefits? Use the other clients who you've worked with to give you the information so that we can talk about it from the perspective of people with lived experience have had A, B, or C. And I also realize that I am just racing through all of this. We want to give folks their resources as well. We want to let them know that there are places where they can call anonymously. We have our latest Canada Suicide Prevention Service. We have the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention. And then to identify your own local respite centers and local warm lines for folks, and have them actually written down, because again, getting to it might be somewhat challenging at the time when they're racing around if they haven't caught their escalation early enough. When we're talking about creating safe environments, we're doing it from a couple of perspectives. One is reducing and removing access to means. So it's, there's talk about, taking anything that they would use, sticking it in a shoebox box, and then wrapping it with Gorilla Tape and throwing it in the trunk of a car or a neighbor's car or in the messiest closet. Identifying who can hold on to medications if there's a perception of risk.
What?
If there's
oh, yeah, just right in the middle of class.
Did somebody have a question? Recognizing that there are times when some people are more vulnerable than others, and if there are items or implements around the house that normally have a function, however, could become a weapon during a particular level of risk, who can you give that stuff to hang on until you feel safe enough to have it? So, for instance, I had a young woman who knew that her cutlery was really dangerous for her, and so I had her kitchen, including a lot of her triggering music, sitting in my office until she came back and said, okay, I think I can use my utensils now. It's getting a little messy at home. We talked about her level of risk, and sure enough, she was perfectly fine to take this stuff back. Sometimes what will happen is people have access to medications or old medications laying around the house that they've just never gotten rid of. Asking to please get rid of the stockpile, whether it be at your pharmacy or take it to your physician, looking at who can hold on to your medications if you're feeling more vulnerable, looking at whether or not you can have your medications dispensed in smaller quantities, and inviting people to take that moment of control for themselves rather than having somebody do it to them. What we're looking at is having our folks recognize they do have moments of control, they do have choices, and they are responsible for their safety. And they can, in fact, do this by making those requests and having those conversations. What we often talk about, some people talk about a comfort box or a safety box, and identifying objects, sounds, textures that may enable them to help them keep themselves safer. Sometimes what we find is that a lot of our folks will experience challenges in sleeping, and when they have this, they get up and they're wandering around. They don't know what to do. Having kind of a comfort or safety box, a favorite, flavor of tea, knitting needles for a knitting project, Sudoku puzzles, an old teddy bear, a book, a rock with which one can hold, an adult coloring book, a kid's coloring book. Make sure you've got the crayons there as well. So it's how do you, in fact, take care of yourself and bring yourself to the here and now when you're creating a safer environment for yourself. And then I think it's really important that we also talk about the obstacles. So it's like preparing for the crisis or planning for the things that are going to get in the way. What are the things that are going to potentially be hiccups? Who are the people who might get in the way? What are the things that you might be able to do to overcome these obstacles? What are some of the things you might need to say in order to get people to move out of the way so that you can, in fact, keep yourself as safe as possible. We definitely encourage clients to share their plans with their family or friends and people close to them. And this is to support them, as well as to have folks be aware of the fact that there are going to be times and they can play a role, because helplessness can really throw an entire system into chaos. So if they can see some of the early warning signs, they can have a conversation, or they know what their role might be. And as we mentioned earlier, make sure that you keep the plan in a really accessible place, as well as with the family members, that they can keep it in an accessible place as well. So things can be caught more quickly earlier on in the event that we want to do our best to A, help people keep themselves safer, as well as use the least intrusive kinds of measures when people's risk starts to escalate. I heard that recently, a recent study done by Stanley and Brown, who created the initial safety plan down in the U.S., they found that it was the distraction activities that a recent study identified, it was distraction strategies. Now, also there's been some research around safety plans, and apparently some of it might be based on, the uptake would be based on who delivers the intervention and talks about the safety plan with the individual. What we find here is that if the safety plan is in fact talked about only in the emergency department, A, they might not remember it, B, they don't care. And a lot of people say that in the emerge or in the hospital, they'll say, yeah, I'll do the plan just to get out of here. So if we follow people who have had suicide attempts or brought to hospital or inpatients because of a suicide attempt or the ideation, as the outpatient person, we also want to ensure that they have a safety plan and it's accessible and they've done it, and if they've tossed it, that we invite them to tell us why they've tossed it and how we can go about creating a new one that is relevant and has meaning for them, not just to get out or the get out of hospital free card. I'm going to stop here for a minute and just see if anybody has any questions or wants to discuss anything more, because I would, in fact, like to make sure that there is room for discussion, and if there are some people who have alternate strategies, that would be really fabulous if you could share those as well.
Hi, Yvonne. It's Samantha here. Thank you so much for providing such valuable information. So as you mentioned, we would like to open it up for some Q&A. And just I want to take this as a reminder for folks to use the Q&A pod that's found on the platform. You'll see it just to the right of the slides, bottom right of your screen. Just go ahead and write some questions there, and we'll be posing them to Yvonne on your behalf.
There's a Q&A.
So Yvonne, there's a question coming in regarding, they're looking for a little bit more discussion around some of the needs to be addressed when dealing with children and youth, and how would that differ from perhaps creating a safety plan with an older adult?
With youth, what I have found is oftentimes they don't have the language to express what's going on. Now, that also goes for a lot of the adults I work with as well. We've got close to 80% who are identified as alexithymic, meaning they have no ability to identify or describe emotion. And this work very much comes out of working with kids from an old personal safety program called Protective Behaviors. And so if we understand behavior as a communication to deep or big feelings, I think for myself, we did a lot of work around articulating what are those big feelings. What is going on inside of you? Is it scared? Is it sad? Is it worry? Is it anxious? And so what we're trying to do is help them develop a language. And would it be helpful if your best friend sat with you? Would it be helpful if you had an adult you could talk to? What would you think that the adult could say or do that might help right now for you to keep safer? So we're looking at creating a language and understanding the behavior as a communication as opposed to just, quote, unquote, dealing with the behavior, which I see a lot. They'll tell kids this is bad, this is unacceptable. So, for instance, if we're looking at non-suicidal self-injury, we're going to ask, how is this helpful? And if a kid is, and adult even, is saying to you, I just want to die, the question is, what is it that you want to end? What is it that you want to go away? What is it that you want to kill? To get some kind of an understanding of what it is that they're experiencing internally that they may or may not have the language to articulate. And again, with kids, it's really, and youth, it's really important. Who are the people who you could go to, and what are the characteristics of those people? How would you know somebody is hearing you? How would you know someone is believing you? How would you know that someone is going to be there for you? And get some indication around the how, because sometimes people will say, this is what I want, and when you say, well, how would you know that? They really don't know. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much, Yvonne. So I guess a little bit on that point. So when we're talking about safe messaging, safe languaging, and how important that is in suicide prevention as well as creating the safety plan, would you recommend that anybody can help somebody who may be vulnerable to suicide or dealing with a crisis to create a safety plan with them, or do you really feel that this is something that should be facilitated with a professional? And kind of how would you help some people who may have burnt some of those bridges with family and friends, etc., and might not have anybody close that they would feel they could share the safety plan with?
Right. I think that if you've got a good relationship with somebody or a decent relationship with somebody, it can be anybody who can create a safety plan. It could be a best friend. It could be a babysitter. It could be a teacher or a guidance counselor. It could be, you know, your best friend's mother. I think that anybody could, in fact, help somebody create one of these safety plans, recognizing for themselves that, you know, the idea is, you know, when you've had these episodes or when you start feeling or you start having these thoughts, how can we together do this so that you can keep yourself safer? And I think that a huge part of it is just having a conversation with somebody who isn't going to freak out. I think that's an incredibly important piece.
Right.
I don't know that creating a safety plan needs to be someone who's close. And I have a lot of clients for whom the only people in their networks are professionals because people in their family and friendship networks have just gotten so freaked out or have stepped away. I think the other thing is how do you know that bridge has been burnt is a good question to ask people, because sometimes there's a difference between perception and reality, because sometimes there are family members or distant family members who do want to be involved. They just don't know how. And the person says, well, no one cares about me. They all abandoned me. That might be part of their internal narrative based on how they are feeling or were feeling at the time. And we need to see whether or not that still holds for the here and now. I find the how do you know or how would you know to be a really helpful question as opposed to the why.
Right, that's excellent. Thank you. And just maybe to clarify, I mean, this is called a suicide prevention, building a safety plan, but would the safety plan be relevant for, let's say, self-harm or any other kind of maybe mental illness that might lead to some kind of crisis, situation where they might need to kind of be brought down and grounded a little bit? So just to clarify whether this is very specific to somebody who might be dealing with thoughts of suicide, or can it be adaptable and change depending on the needs of the client or the person?
I think it's totally transferable, completely transferable to any kind of a situation. It's, how do you keep yourself as safe as possible, or how do you keep yourself well, or how do you keep yourself grounded? It can happen in all kinds of situations. It doesn't just have to be about suicide. And I think that a lot of the stuff that we talk about is relevant right across in terms of mental health or other crisis strategies or other challenges that we have. It's not just suicide, however, it's helpful in this context that we're talking about.
Yeah, it's really great to have a template like that's pretty easy to navigate and easily adaptable to different situations. So I guess on that note, would you suggest that it would be a really good idea to include a section in the safety plan about what others can do for you in time of crisis? So there's a lot of who can you reach out to, what can you do to keep yourself safe? Do you feel that there is benefit to adding a section on what others can do, what's helpful for others to react to, etc.?
I think that's where the conversation happens in the two sections. I think it's 2 and 3, in terms of what can you do to help me distract or help me keep myself safer. What are some of the things that you can do, like don't criticize me or don't tell me that I look fat and ugly in that particular dress. You might want to say it looks like you just got your safe dress on right now, or your comfy dress, or whether if you're taking care of yourself and you're wearing your onesie that they say looks like you need some comforting today, can I make you a cup of tea? And I think that people need to be taught that as well. And one of the clients identified that when they were working on the safety plan, they had a friend, and the friend said, you know what, I'm a doer and I'm really good in a crisis. So that's the person who'll be the driver in case they need to get to hospital, or in case they need to be walked to hospital, or they just need somebody to take them for a very brisk and fast walk or a run. So absolutely, and you do that with your care providers as well, in terms of what can you do when I am in crisis. That would be helpful. Again, it's having that conversation of this is what I need, this is your strength, would you be able to do A, B, or C? When it comes to care providers, family members, and friends, it also means taking a look and saying, not making the promise of I'm always available. It's I will do my best to be as available as I can be, and know that there are times when I might not be, and these might be those times. So I think it's keeping it very realistic and practical, and that only happens through conversation.
That's great. Thank you so much. So is a safety plan something that somebody can expect upon arrival at a hospital? Is this something that the frontline workers, the nurses, will help you either create or would work through with you if you already have a safety plan. And is it possible, do you know, to perhaps get a safety plan on your medical records so that it's not something that you're forced to carry around with you at all times?
Sorry, I don't mean to laugh at you. However, we just finished doing a review of 1,300 charts and realized that there were no safety plans on any of them. And also in the emerge or in hospital, they tend to do crisis plans, whereas I tend to like to focus on safety as a crisis versus crisis, because that's what we're working towards, keeping yourself as safe as possible. So part of the Zero Suicide Initiative created in the States talks about the utilization of safety plans, and I know that it needs to be something that a hospital or a department actually takes on and makes a commitment to. We're working on that right now. In the intervention that I do and in the individual sessions that I do for our urgent care program, I've made it part of my practice. This is what I do. If I go to the emerge, if I work in the group, and when I work individually, I talk about a safety plan. And I'm in the process right now of creating training for emerge staff so that they will use it, and then we're going to measure whether or not it's actually in the record. For people who are well known to us, their safety plan might be in their ghost chart for staff. The challenge is having staff read it and having them actually go back to the chart. So you want to see if you can, in fact, create some kind of policy or procedure whereby everybody's on board with putting it on the chart so that everybody else can see it and know what page we're all on. So no, you cannot expect it right now, and yes, you can ask for it.
That's great. That's very helpful. Thank you so much. So there's a few questions kind of circling around. So if somebody is, for example, feeling down or in that state of crisis, it might be difficult for someone to step in and try to walk through the safety plan with them. They might not know what some of the warning signs are. They might not be as open to conversation as they might have been previously. And so kind of how to navigate some of those difficult situations, and if you feel that they really do need to seek professional help and they have them listed on their safety plan, but in the moment are unresponsive and unwilling to call or to follow any of the steps, like how would you recommend kind of navigating that situation?
When the iron is cold, you return to that situation and say, what do you give me unbridled permission to do? And that's the thing about the safety plan, is it's not static. You return to it when you start learning about the bumps and humps and things that get in the way. You want to try and catch it earlier when the person hasn't gotten into a place where they're either stuck and stubborn or they're so far into the emotional salad spinner, all you can do is work with them to keep safe. And they're going to need help to do that. So there are going to be times when they miss all the warning signs, and when we see them or get to them, they're already at the apex, and their bottom line is about safety. What are you going to do to help this person keep safe? And sometimes that means calling 911, which is the worst thing in the world to have to do sometimes. And, you know, again, you can have that conversation when the iron's cooler. Because I think, as most of you know, that there are times when you can just look at a person and you know rational thought is not going to happen here. So that's where we step right back into the validation, the naming of the language, the contextualization, and the normalization, in keeping them as safe as they possibly can. So you're looking at basic de-escalation at that point, de-escalation strategies where, you know, you have to reassure, you validate the distress, you normalize the feelings, you name the feelings, and try to do as much as you can in terms of giving them back choice and control before you move into any of the problem-solving stuff. Because you're right, it is hard to step in, and as much as you want to give the person control and choice throughout the period of time, it's a dance, and sometimes you're not going to get there. So again, give yourself permission to be able to talk about it when the iron is cold and return to it and say, okay, how does this need a little bit of fine-tuning or adjustment?
That's great. Thank you. So there's quite a few questions, a little bit more specifically around resources. Like a few people have asked if you can maybe talk a little bit more or explain the differences between the crisis line and a warm line. And if you can maybe dive, if you have any suggestions, into some of the apps that might be available for folks. So one had mentioned the Be Safe app. Is there any other kind of tangible resources that are easily accessible that you are aware of?
Okay, so first of all, a warm line versus a crisis line. Warm lines are usually lines that are run by agencies who have people with lived experience. And they tend not to be 24/7. They tend to be within a very specified period of time. And this is support. This is somebody who is going to be able to talk to you, listen to you, whereas crisis lines tend to either be paid or volunteer folks who have been fairly heavily and highly trained in crisis intervention. And yeah, so in terms of apps available, I am going to suggest that probably people on this call know a whole lot more about those things than I do. I just got a work cell phone last week, so I just came off a pager, so my learning curve is still in growth. How about we put it that way? So there might be people on the call who have great apps. I know that a number of my folks use an implement called a Muse, which is biofeedback regarding grounding themselves and bringing themselves to a calmer state. A number of my clients have identified that, and a number of the clients have also talked about various apps around substance use that they have found very helpful in tracking and providing feedback. So I don't know if people can see any of the chat or other screen things that folks could write down in terms of apps, because that's not my skill set, sorry. Ask me in a year, I might know a little bit more.
That's great. Yeah, and on the topic of apps, Yvonne, as you're aware, the Commission is putting forward some toolkits, one which will be geared for people with lived experience related to a suicide attempt, and the other for people related to a suicide loss, both of which will be providing some different apps out there that might help to support. So perhaps in the meantime, if anybody knows of any really great apps, feel free to send an email to me directly, and we can share that out. That's not a problem. There was a question around the efficacy and if safety planning has been evaluated academically, and is it proven to be helpful at all, or is this just something that we're kind of trial and error at this point, and it seems to be working at a case-by-case level?
Well, that's a good question. If you look up Stanley and Brown, they have some research talking about the efficacy of the safety plan. They're in the States, and I believe they're from Columbia, so their stuff is quite accessible. I think that we're still looking at a case-by-case basis. I look at some of my clients and we talk about the safety plan, we create a safety plan, and they never look at it again. And then I have others who say, yeah, it was really helpful. And there are others who tell me they hate my guts, but their mothers love me because their mother uses it for them. So you're going to have all kinds of different reactions. I think that it's one of many things that we need to try out and use with people to find out what fits for each individual. And sometimes it might be a matter of timing. You know, they might not be so willing to look at a safety plan at one point, and then later down the road they're more open to saying, yeah, maybe I need to do something like that. So in terms of the efficacy, I think we're looking at suicide being so incredibly complex and so incredibly unique to individual. The intervention strategies that we use are equally as unique and complex to each individual, and just because it doesn't work once, it does not mean it might not work later on. So it's use what you can is what I would say in terms of safety plans, as well as all of the other crisis de-escalation, early warning signs, scales of intensity, that kind of thing. Don't hold back at this point just because there isn't a ton of writing on it. What we're looking at is, again, person taking a moment of control, recognizing that they have a choice to choose not to die in the moment, and that there is and are people and things they can do to keep safer.
That's great. Thank you so much. So, I mean, we have over 300 people on the line today, so unfortunately we can't get to everybody's questions. But we did try to address as many topics as we could. So thank you all again for your questions and comments. This led to a very great conversation. Yvonne, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. So just on a couple of logistics notes, our next suicide prevention webinar will take place on Thursday, May 18th, and that will be delivered in English. And just another final note that we would like you to please fill out a survey that will pop up after this webinar. It just kind of helps us to evaluate how we did, if the topic was relevant, and if you had any suggestions for future topics or speakers for our upcoming webinars, they would be greatly appreciated. Another great big thank you to our speaker today, so Dr. Yvonne Bergmans. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. And a big thank you to my colleagues here in the room, Hannah and Allison, that helped me run this webinar today. We really do hope that we see you at our future webinars. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Take care.